Asher Maxwell will now come up to introduce our guest.
Today is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Joe Hodgson. He will be speaking to us today in honor of Native American History Month. He is a retired landscape architect who worked on MBA's campus and on the Long Mountain campus since 1990. He's also the father of 2 MBA graduates, Mac, who graduated in 1999, and Sam in 2004. Since he retired, he's been developing an apple orchard at Harrison Ferry Mountain and has donated over 30,000 apples to the Nashville Food Project. Today, he will speak to us about how the development of his orchard led to the discovery of the Trail of Tears on the Cumberland Plateau and the fascinating story of the Cherokee chief Junaluska and his apple. Additionally, we also have an evening program coming up on January 27th at MBA, at which state archaeologist Aaron Dieterwolf will present some of his findings regarding Native American settlements in Middle Tennessee. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Hodgson.
Good morning, and thank you. I want to thank Asher. I want to thank Dr. Bailey for inviting me. I also want to thank Brad. 16, maybe 17 years ago, you asked me to go up to Long Mountain and take a look at a 125 acres piece of property that MBA had been given and see what we could do with it. And in that process, I discovered Overton Retreat. We loved it enough that we ended up building a cabin there. And that has resulted in me being here today because of that. As Asher said, I retired some 3 or 4 years ago. As part of that process, I needed a project. I'm one of these project guys, need to be busy. So we decided that we would start an apple orchard on the plateau to grow apples for food banks. And in that process, we sort of made several discoveries. Let's look at the next slide. This is a slide showing a tax map of Warren and Van Buren County. And the blue line that you can see running through the middle of that property is owned by the state of Tennessee. Now, I was looking for property to buy to grow apples, to create an apple orchard, but I kept looking at this strange line on the piece of property, on the tax map, in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere. Highway 8 that you drive up when you go to Long Mountain is almost to the bottom of that sheet. So it's in a very isolated area in the middle of nowhere. Later, I discovered by a friend of mine sending me a document that this was a remnant of the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears took many forms. It was actually 17 different routes that the Trail of Tears took. But this is one of them, and we'll look at that in a little more detail. Okay, next slide. This is a 1834 image of a map of the state of Tennessee, and I'm sorry, but you can't see this very well. About where the first S is in Tennessee is McMinnville, but the Cumberland Plateau was a very isolated area. It didn't have arable soils. They weren't soils in which people could grow food. They didn't have gardens, and they didn't plant corn and things like that. It was a forest. It was basically a forest with very, very few roads crossing the Cumberland Plateau. So we had an isolated area. Very few people came into that area at all. Okay, next slide. This shows the basic Trail of Tear trails map going out of North Georgia, Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, and North Alabama. Those blue lines represent where the Cherokee Indians coming out of those areas travel to Oklahoma. Now, as part of our awareness of Native Americans, you should also know that the Indian Removal Act of 1830, enacted by our 7th president, Andrew Jackson, removed all the Native Americans out of the Southeast, not just the Cherokee. They removed the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Seminoles. They were all moved out west. as a part of this. But this is the Cherokee Trail of Tears. So let's go to the next slide. This slide shows a detail looking at around the Chattanooga area. The trail coming from the far right, that's coming out of the western North Carolina mountains. It comes down to the Tennessee River, which is now Chickamauga Lake, and then it crosses over into the Sequatchie Valley. The two forks going to your northwest on that map represents what's called the northern route. The northern route of the Trail of Tears is the route of our interest. We had 16,000 Native Americans that left out of this area and traveled to Oklahoma. 9,800 of those 16,000 came by our orchard. We discovered that our orchard was actually on the Trail of Tears. They came out in increments of about 1,000. These Native Americans were forcibly removed from their homes in the Carolinas and marched with an army attachment to Oklahoma. It took about 3 months, and in that process, there were 1,300 Native Americans that were lost, that died in that process. Okay, next slide. This is a little bit more detailed map. Right in the very center of that map, where those two lines come together, is McMinnville. And then our orchard is almost about 5 miles to the east of that. Next map. And this is the last map, and as that line turns and heads, this is a very detailed shot of the Trail of Tears as it comes by and starts to head back down to the southwest. That's where our orchard is located. Now, as you see in the middle of that slide, sort of a darker area, that's Dyer Gulch. Dyer Gulch is basically the Rocky River headwater. And Long Mountain's campus is on that precipice of Dyer Gulch, about 3 miles by the crow flies from here. So the Trail of Tears is about 3 to 4 miles from the campus at Long Mountain, for MBA campus. Okay, next slide. This is actually a little image of our orchard. It's a little hard to see, but we've got the dashed line going around the perimeter. That black dashed line is actually the Trail of Tears. Fortunately, we could zoom in on this National Park Service map of the Trail of Tears and actually plot exactly where it went. It actually went right by our orchard. I didn't realize it at the time we bought the property or built the orchard. It was only years later, actually this last year, that I discovered, oh, the Trail of Tears comes through the orchard. As we've traveled back and forth to the plateau over the last 15 years, we found a number of Indian artifacts. But most of those probably came through some earlier settlements or earlier hunting groups on the plateau. Okay, next slide. Now this is where our story takes a turn. On the left is Andrew Jackson, who was at the time of 1812, the Battle of 1812 in the Creek Indian Wars. He was a general in the United States, and he led the fight against the Creeks. The Creeks were a Native American group that had aligned themselves with the British, and General Jackson was fighting them in Alabama. He called Chief Junaluska, who is the Indian chief shown on the right. Chief Junaluska came out of an area of western North Carolina that today is Robbinsville, North Carolina. That's where his village was. And General Jackson called Chief Junaluska and said, please come help me. We're fighting the Creeks down in Alabama. We need your help. So Chief Junaluska brought 500 warriors out of the North Carolina mountains in 1812 into Alabama, about 60 miles north of Auburn, Alabama, to an area called Horseshoe Bend. And at Horseshoe Bend, Chief Junaluska aided Andrew Jackson in defeating the Creeks. There were over 2,000 Creeks. They had 500 Cherokee plus the Americans, and they won their battle. At the end of that battle, they brought in the prisoners One of the prisoners grabs a knife out of somebody's belt and lunges at Andrew Jackson. Chief Junaluska stops him. At that time, Andrew Jackson says to Chief Junaluska, "As long as the sun shines and the grass grows, there shall be friendship between us, and the feet of the Cherokee shall be toward the east." I was curious, what does that mean, toward the east? Why would their feet be toward the east, and why would that be important? Well, it ends up that the Native American, as they wake each morning, pray. They're a very religious group. They pray and they face the east. They pray to the 7 points on their compass, which includes the 4 cardinal points that we have, which are north, south, east, and west. But they also pray to the sky, to the earth, and to the center theirself. So he had told him that they would always be friends. But 18 years later, he enacted the Indian Removal Act, which caused all these tribes to be removed from their homes to travel west. Chief Junaluska came by our orchard out of Robbinsville, North Carolina. And he was later heard to say that if I had known that Jackson would drive us from our homes, I would have killed him that day at Horseshoe. So there's a conflict that exists between them. But I was continuing to be curious about Junaluska, and I looked more into his history and found, to my surprise, that he had his favorite apple. Believe it or not, a lot of people have their favorite apples. You probably do too. Thomas Jefferson had his favorite apple, the Albemarle Pippin. Andrew Jackson had his favorite apple. Chief Junaluska had his favorite apple. But that apple was lost to history until about 20 years ago, a gentleman out of Clemens, North Carolina named Tom Brown started researching the Junaluska apple and found it in North Georgia, of all places, growing, and he started to propagate it. The next slide, please. Now, I am planting the Junaluska apple at our orchard, and there's a picture of the apple there, in honor of Chief Junaluska and the many Native Americans that travel by our place. That's it.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for